Before hundreds of people, she was forced to marry a man who barely looked at her, and who made a point of publicly despising her as if she were invisible. In a palace filled with luxury, every detail made it clear that that marriage was not love, but a cold and calculated agreement. Humiliated before everyone, she believed that would be just another phase of a life marked by silence and submission. But when the door finally closed and they were alone, a dangerous truth came to light. And everything that seemed like contempt hid something much greater. Before discovering what really happened behind that door, don't forget to follow for more intense stories full of twists. The dress weighed more than she expected. Not because of the fabric, a satiny ivory that the seamstresses had adjusted 3 times in the last few days, but because of everything it represented. Mariana Sousa Cavalcante was standing before the mirror of the room she had been assigned in the Palacio Alvorada dos Lagos, a private mansion a few kilometers from Lago Paranoa in Brasilia, and she did not recognize the woman staring back at her from the other side of the glass. 32 years, almost half of them spent serving. She had grown up in Taguatinga, the daughter of a retired accountant and a public school teacher. The family was not poor, but there were no surpluses either. When her father fell ill, Mariana was 23 years old and had a job as an analyst in a logistics company. Gradually, without anyone needing to ask, she took over everything. The appointments, the medicines, the electricity bill, the groceries. Her younger sister finished college with Mariana's money. Her mother renovated the kitchen with Mariana's bonus. And Mariana, in turn, kept postponing everything that was hers, her plans, her dreams, her life. When her father passed away, she was left with the feeling that she had given her best years to a just cause, but that the world had not taken note of it. It was in this state of silent exhaustion that the proposal arrived. It wasn't she who received the first contact. It was her mother, through an acquaintance who worked in the Senate office. The Drummond Asuncion family was looking for a bride for their eldest son, Rafael. The news sounded absurd, almost comical. Families that sought brides through intermediaries existed in 6 p.m. soap operas, not in today's Brasilia. But the proposal was real, and the amounts involved, an amount that would cover all the family's debts and still have some left over, made any objection harder to sustain. Mariana's mother cried when presenting the situation. She said she wasn't forcing anyone. She said she understood if the answer was no. But Mariana saw in the woman's eyes the weight of accumulated years, the guilt of having accepted too much without offering enough, and she didn't have the courage to refuse. She said yes. She met Rafael Drummond, Asuncion, exactly once before the wedding, at a formal lunch in a restaurant in Lago Sul. He arrived 20 minutes late, greeted her with a brief handshake, and spent most of the meeting on the phone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with well-cut dark hair and an expression that alternated between indifference and calculation. He was not unpleasant in appearance. He was simply absent. When he left, he only said that the lawyers would send the documents soon, and so Mariana reached her wedding day without knowing absolutely anything about the man she was about to marry. The Palacio Alvorada dos Lagos had belonged to the Drummond Asuncion family for almost 40 years. It was a construction that mixed the vocabulary of Brazilian modernist architecture with the discreet ostentation that marked powerful families in Brasilia. Large halls with high ceilings, impeccable gardens facing the lake, corridors lined with noble wood, and works of art that Mariana didn't know how to name, but that clearly cost what she would earn in decades of work. The ceremony was scheduled for 6 o'clock. 320 guests, as informed by the advisor responsible for the organization, a woman named Conceição, who treated her with efficiency and without any affection. Dinner would be served in the main hall. There were hired photographers, a string quartet, flowers imported from Holambra arranged in displays that reached shoulder height. None of that was for Mariana. She understood this with a clarity that didn't hurt her as much as it should. That party was a demonstration of power. It was for the guests, for the allies, for the rivals who would observe every detail in search of weaknesses. She was an element of the scene, not the protagonist. When she went down the stairs and walked through the marble corridor toward the garden where the improvised altar had been set up, she felt all the eyes. They were not looks of admiration. They were evaluative looks, some curious, many loaded with a judgment she didn't need to hear to understand. Who is this woman? Where did she come from? What does she have that justifies being here? Raphael was waiting for her, before the celebrant with his hands clasped behind his back. When she reached his side, he didn't turn his face. He didn't smile. He looked forward, as if she hadn't arrived yet. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. At no point did he look her directly in the eyes. At the banquet, the seats were arranged so that Mariana was to Raphael's right, but separated from him by a distance that on any other occasion would be considered strange for a newlywed couple. She sat between the wife of a senator, who greeted her with a quick smile and then turned her body completely to the opposite side, and a press secretary who spent the night on the phone in a low voice. Raphael stood up to make a toast. He spoke about the family, about the legacy, about the future. In none of the sentences pronounced in those 3 minutes did he mention her name. Mariana raised her glass when the others raised theirs. She drank when the others drank. She smiled when she thought she should smile. Inside there was a silence so complete that it almost hurt. Later, when the guests began to disperse and the quartet's music was replaced by the murmur of goodbyes, one of the women who had spent the night in Raphael's closest group, elegant, perfumed, with earrings that must have cost more than Mariana's monthly salary, leaned slightly toward her and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "What a beautiful party. You were barely noticed, my dear." Mariana didn't answer. She kept her smile in place and turned her face in the opposite direction. But the words remained. When the last guest left and the employees began to collect the glasses and arrangements, Conceição approached and indicated with a gesture that Mariana should follow her to the upper floor. The couple's room was at the end of the corridor, behind a dark wooden door with a bronze handle. Mariana stopped before it for a moment. On the other side of that door began a life she hadn't chosen, in the company of a man who had ignored her for hours before hundreds of people. She took a deep breath, turned the handle and entered. The room was large, lit by a single bedside lamp that cast an amber light over the walls covered in beige fabric. There were 2 distinct sides to the bed. It was impossible not to notice, and on top of each bedside table there was a glass of water and nothing more. No flowers, no note, no gesture that recognized that night was different from any other. Raphael was standing by the window, his jacket already removed, his hands resting on the sill, looking at the dark garden below. He didn't turn when she entered. He stayed like that for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. Mariana left her bag on the armchair in the corner of the room and stood still, not knowing if she should speak first or wait. There was a tension there that was not of misunderstanding, but of something more opaque, as if both knew that something was about to change, but neither wanted to be the first to name it. She observed his profile against the faint reflection of the moon on the lake, and for the first time since she had met him, she realized that there was something in the rigidity of that body that was not arrogance. It was vigilance. It was the exhaustion of someone who spends a long time protecting themselves from things others cannot see. This perception did not quiet her, but it made her wait a bit longer before saying anything. It was he who spoke first. Without turning his face, with a low and controlled voice, as if choosing each word before releasing it, "I know today was difficult, and I know you deserved more explanations before getting here." Mariana didn't answer immediately. She let the silence occupy the space between them for a moment, and then said with a calmness that surprised even herself, "Then give me those explanations now." Raphael turned, and for the first time since they had met, he truly looked at her. Raphael turned slowly, like someone abandoning a guard he had maintained all day. The amber light from the lamp outlined the shadows of his face, and Mariana saw for the first time something she hadn't noticed during the ceremony or during the banquet. He looked exhausted. Not the tiredness of a long celebration, but something deeper, settled over weeks or months. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying a weight they cannot put on the ground. He walked to the armchair opposite the one where she had dropped her bag, sat down and rested his elbows on his knees for a moment, looking at the Persian rug that covered the center of the room. Mariana didn't move. She stood, the dress still on her body, waiting. When he began to speak, his voice was different from the one she had heard during lunch in Lago Sul and during the wedding toast. It was quieter, more direct, as if the formal environment had finally been discarded along with the jacket. He said there was a reason for the marriage that went beyond what they had communicated to her family. The official narrative, an agreement between traditional families, a mutual convenience, was only partly true. What no one knew, except him and now her, was that Raphael had discovered weeks before that a group of people close to him, family advisors, allies of decades, had organized to undermine his position at the head of the Drummond Asunción businesses. Not in a violent way, but with a precision that was almost crueler, planting doubts, redirecting contracts, discreetly isolating him from decisions that were legally his. The strategy of this group depended on one thing, that Raphael did not have someone of absolute trust by his side. Someone who didn't belong to that circle, who had nothing to gain from his fall and nothing to lose from his rise. Someone who could move around without being monitored. Any bride with already established political or social connections would automatically become a target. She would be pressured, seduced, co-opted. He had evaluated this with cold precision and reached a conclusion that sounded brutal, but that he presented without apologizing. The woman by his side needed to be someone others didn't take seriously. Mariana heard all this without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "You chose me because I was disposable." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, and they both knew the difference. Raphael didn't look away. "I chose you because you were invisible to them. That is different." "To you too?" The question hung in the air. He took a moment before answering. "No. To me, no." Mariana went to the window, taking the place where he had been before. Outside, the garden was plunged in darkness, and the lake's surface reflected the faint glow of the stars. She thought about how she had gotten there, years of choices that weren't choices, of lives she had sustained while her own stood at a standstill. And now she was in a palace in Brasilia, married to a man who had publicly humiliated her by strategy. Listening to the explanation of why that had been necessary, she should be angry, and she was. But there was something else too, something she didn't expect to find in that room. The strange and disconcerting feeling that for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at her and seen something real. Even if out of interest, even if out of convenience. He had noticed that she knew how to observe without being noticed. He had perceived the resilience that she herself sometimes forgot she had, and that, however small it was different from everything she had experienced in recent years. She turned from the window and faced him. "And what exactly do you expect from me?" Raphael stood up. He walked to the desk in the corner of the room, opened a drawer, and took out a thin folder, which he placed on the surface without opening it. "There is a circle of women here in the palace, wives of advisors, of parliamentarians, of people who have frequented this house for decades. They know everything. Not because someone informs them directly, but because information circulates naturally among them, at lunches, at receptions, inside conversations that men ignore because they underestimate what happens in those spaces." He paused. Then he continued, "I need someone to enter that circle, who listens, who understands what is being said between the lines, and who brings me what is relevant." Mariana looked at the folder without touching it. "And in exchange, you will have access to resources you never had, and when all this ends, and it will end, you will leave here with the life you want to build, without debts, without obligations, free." She was quiet for a long moment. The ceiling fan turned slowly above them, and from the garden came the distant sound of crickets on the shore of the lake. "There is one condition," she said at last. He waited. "Honesty, always. If I am going to risk my position in this game, I want to know the real rules. No omissions, no half-words, no manipulations that keep me in the dark while you conduct everything behind the scenes." Raphael looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't exactly surprise. It was something more like recognition, as if that condition were somehow the right answer to a question he hadn't yet asked out loud. He extended his hand. Mariana looked at it for a second, then she shook it. The grip was firm, direct, without ceremony. There was nothing romantic about that gesture. It was an agreement between two people who had decided, for very different reasons, that it was worth betting on each other. When she let go of his hand and went to the bathroom to prepare for sleep, she could still hear his footsteps on the other side of the door. She thought about everything that had changed in the last few hours, and everything that was still to come. And she realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that for the first time in years, she wasn't simply reacting to what life imposed on her. She had made a choice with real risks and unpredictable consequences, but her own choice. And that, however small it seemed, was a beginning. She took a long time to fall asleep. She lay on the right side of the bed, eyes open, listening to his calm breathing on the opposite side, as distant as any two strangers could be sharing the same space. The ceiling of the room had a slightly irregular texture, and she watched the shadows the lamp projected on that surface, trying to organize everything she had heard that night. There were pieces that still didn't fit. Who exactly were the people working against Raphael? What did they want, after all? What kind of information circulated among the women of the palace that could be decisive for him? She had accepted the agreement without yet fully understanding the dimension of what she was facing, and this awareness bothered her. But there was something she knew for sure. Her public version, the irrelevant, ignored, disposable wife, was armor. And wearing armor was something Mariana Sousa Cavalcante knew very well. For years she had lived like that, absorbing what others didn't want to carry, without anyone realizing how much it weighed. The difference this time was that the weight served a purpose she had chosen. When she finally closed her eyes, the last thought that crossed her mind before sleep was not of fear or regret. It was the image of the woman with the expensive earring leaning toward her during the banquet and saying she had barely been noticed. And Mariana thought, perfect. In the following days, the rhythm of the Palacio Alvorada dos Lagos revealed its routines like a living organism that only makes sense when observed from within. Mariana woke up early, before everyone, and walked through the corridors of the lower floor, while the house was still quiet and the employees began to prepare breakfast. She learned the sounds, the noise of the service door that creaked slightly when opening, Conceição's footsteps on the stone floor of the office, Raphael's distant voice on the phone on the upper floor that invariably began before 7 o'clock in the morning. She observed, it was what she knew how to do best. Raphael had started what he called, without any solemnity, lessons. They weren't lessons in the formal sense. There were no notebooks or schedules. It was a daily conversation, usually after dinner, in the back office that he kept closed to the employees. They sat on opposite sides of the work desk and he spoke about the people who frequented that house, about the patterns of behavior she should learn to identify, about how power in Brasilia rarely showed itself directly. It lived in gestures, in absences, in the words that were not said. In the first conversation, he placed a sheet with names on the table. 17 people, advisors, parliamentarians, businessmen, and their respective wives or partners. Each name was accompanied by 2 or 3 pieces of information: position, relationship with the Drummond Assunção family, and a short observation about habitual behavior. Next to the name of Teresa Valmont, wife of the chief advisor Armando Valmont, Raphael had written only, "She knows everything." Mariana looked at those words for a long moment. She knows everything, and yet she is on their side? Raphael answered without hesitating. She is on the side of whoever is most convenient. Teresa Valmont has no loyalties. She has positions, and her position can change if she believes the balance has shifted. That was the first real lesson. There were no permanent allies in that game. There were temporary interests that aligned or moved apart as the scenario changed. Understanding this wasn't cynical. It was necessary. The second lesson came from a concrete situation. On the 4th day after the wedding, Conceição informed that there would be an informal lunch at the palace the following afternoon. A group of 8 women, wives of advisors and parliamentarians, who frequented the property regularly. It was a routine meeting without an official agenda, the kind that had happened for years in that space, and for the first time since she had arrived, Mariana would be formally introduced to this group. Raphael prepared her the night before, not with instructions on what to say, but on what not to do. Don't show excessive knowledge. Don't ask direct questions. Don't take sides in any discussion that arises. And above all, don't reveal any tension between her and him. The public staging of indifference needed to be maintained even in smaller environments. If someone asks how you feel about the marriage, he said, answer that you are adapting. Don't deny the coldness. Let them draw their own conclusions. Mariana thought that was cruel, but she said nothing. She was learning to distinguish what was cruel in a gratuitous way from what was cruel out of necessity. That, for now, seemed to be the second type. The lunch took place on a covered veranda overlooking the garden. The table was set with fine china, and the service was silent and efficient. The 8 women arrived in groups of 2 or 3, greeting each other with the intimacy of those who have met for years in that same space. Mariana arrived last intentionally. Conceição had guided her on the time, and she had understood the reason without needing to ask. Entering after everyone means entering when the groups are already formed, when conversations have already started, when the arrival of someone new causes a natural pause that serves for observation. She greeted each one with a polite smile and positioned herself in the indicated place, at the end of the table, slightly away from the center where conversations tended to concentrate. The perfect place to listen without being observed. Teresa Valmont sat at the center, as was to be expected. She was a woman in her late 50s, dark hair with impeccably integrated white strands, discreet jewelry that Mariana recognized as expensive. She commanded the rhythm of the conversation without appearing to do so. A question here, a comment there, a calculated silence that invited others to fill in. Mariana observed everything carefully. The conversation went through banal themes in the first 20 minutes. A trip to Lisbon, a dinner in São Paulo, the heat of Brasilia in October. And then, almost without transition, Teresa turned her face toward Mariana, with a smile that was gentle on the surface and evaluative underneath. Mariana, how has the adaptation been? The palace can be a bit overwhelming at first. It was a trap disguised as courtesy. Mariana smiled calmly. It's being a learning experience. Each day reveals something new. The answer was vague enough not to give anything away, and honest enough not to seem defensive. Teresa tilted her head slightly, as if deciding what that meant, and then followed the conversation in another direction. But one of the women next to Teresa, younger, named Deborah, wife of a parliamentarian from the north of the country, did not disguise it as much. She said, while cutting a piece of chicken on her plate, "I heard Rafael barely greeted you during the ceremony. It must be hard to start like that." There was a fraction of a second of silence at the table. Some of the women looked at Mariana with expressions ranging from curiosity to feigned embarrassment. Mariana placed her fork on the plate with the tranquility of someone who wasn't hit. She looked at Deborah with a serene smile. "Arranged marriages have their own rhythms. Rafael and I are building ours." The answer was enough to end the matter without any drama. Teresa went back to leading the conversation, and the lunch continued without further direct provocations. But when Mariana left, hours later, and locked herself in her room to mentally review everything she had heard, she realized she had captured something important. Young Deborah hadn't made that comment out of her own cruelty. There was something in the way she glanced at Teresa right after, waiting for a reaction, that revealed she was testing Mariana on behalf of someone else. She noted this mentally with care, and when she met Rafael that night for the daily report, she began with exactly that observation. He listened without interrupting. And when she finished, there was an expression on his face that she took a moment to identify. It was respect. He didn't say it in words. But there was an unspoken language she was learning to read the same way she learned to read the women at the lunch table, by gestures, by pauses, by the things he chose not to say. After she finished the report, he went to the shelf and took out a folder she hadn't seen yet. It was thicker than the first one, with colored dividers between the sections. He placed it on the table in front of her. "Now you need to understand what is behind the names." And he began to speak about the Drummond Council, not the formal board of directors, which existed on paper and in official records, but the informal group that had consolidated over years around Rafael's father. They were men who had built fortunes and reputations under the shadow of the Drummond Asunção family, and who saw the younger generation as an obstacle to the continuity of a system that had served them very well. Mariana listened with growing attention. The picture Raphael painted was complex, and she had the feeling of finally seeing the complete map of a territory she had stepped on without understanding. She looked at the names listed in the folder, and she thought that 2 weeks ago she was an analyst in a logistics company in Taguatinga, choosing between paying the electricity bill or the internet bill. Life, when it decided to change, didn't give advance notice. And the question wasn't what had happened to her. It was what she would do from now on. The second week at Palacio Alvorada dos Lagos brought with it an invitation that Raphael received with an expression Mariana had already learned to recognize as caution disguised as neutrality. It was a formal dinner organized by advisor Armando Valmont at his private residence in Lago Sul, a mansion that, according to Raphael, was double the size of the palace and had all the architectural coldness of someone who builds to impress and not to inhabit. The invitation included the couple. It was the first time the two would be seen together at an event outside the palace since the wedding ceremony. Raphael explained the situation that night in the office with the same precision that had characterized all previous conversations. Valmont's dinner was, on the surface, a celebration of a newly signed business agreement. In practice, it was an opportunity for the advisor and his allies to observe Raphael up close, evaluate his state, his reactions, and in particular his wife's behavior in an environment controlled by them. "They will try to create situations that make you uncomfortable," he said. "Apparently innocent comments, questions about your family, about your past. The goal is to see if you react, if you reveal vulnerabilities." Mariana listened and asked, "And what should I do?" "What you already know how to do." She thought about that while choosing her dress on the morning of the dinner. There was a closet in the room that had been filled with clothes she hadn't bought, elegant, neutral pieces suitable for that universe. Someone had thought of that even before she arrived. She chose a navy blue dress with a clean cut, without excesses, and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. The woman in the mirror looked different from the one who had looked at that same surface on the wedding day. It wasn't the dress. It was something in the eyes, a firmness that hadn't been there before or that had been dormant for too long. She was ready. Valmont's mansion was 20 minutes from the palace, and during the journey, Raphael and Mariana traveled in silence in the back seat of the car. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two strategists mentally reviewing a plan before entering the field. When the car stopped at the illuminated entrance of the property and an employee opened the door, Raphael got out first and extended his hand to Mariana. She accepted it, and the two walked together to the entrance. It was the first time he had made that gesture, and she didn't miss the attention it attracted from the other guests arriving at the same time. The staging had begun. Valmont's hall was exactly what Raphael had described, imposing, cold, decorated with pieces that communicated power without communicating affection. The walls carried paintings that seemed selected by curation and not by taste. The floral arrangements were white and very tall. There were about 40 guests distributed in groups, and the buzz of conversations filled the environment with that specific sound of people who know each other well enough not to need to make an effort. Armando Valmont approached in the very first minutes. He was a man in his 60s, with completely white hair, medium height, with the posture of someone used to being the center of things. He greeted Raphael with the calculated familiarity of someone who had frequented the same house for decades, and then turned his gaze to Mariana with a smile that had all the form of cordiality and none of its substance. "What a pleasure to finally get to know you better, Mariana. Raphael told us so little about you that I was starting to think you were a well-kept secret," she replied with a smile identical to his in temperature. "I prefer to let people form their own impressions." Valmont laughed, a short, evaluative laugh. Very wise, and he moved on to greet other guests. Raphael lightly pressed her arm for a second, a discreet gesture she correctly interpreted as approval, and then the two separated, as they had agreed. She would circulate through the side of the hall where the women were. He would stay with the men. Teresa Valmont was at the center of a group of 5 people, near the window overlooking the illuminated garden. She greeted Mariana with that smile she had learned to catalogue, pleasant on the surface, evaluative underneath. "You look stunning today. That blue suits you." "Thank you, Teresa. Your house is beautiful." It was her husband's house, and both knew it, but the compliment was accepted naturally. The women in the group moved slightly to include her, and the conversation continued. Mariana stayed for 40 minutes in that circle. She spoke little, listened a lot. She learned that the daughter of one of the parliamentarians had recently ended an engagement, a subject treated with comments that had the tone of concern and the content of judgment. She learned that there was unresolved tension between the families of 2 of the advisors present, related to a contract that had been redirected without prior consultation. And she heard, almost by chance, a phrase that Teresa said in a low voice to the woman beside her, thinking Mariana was not close enough to hear. "Raphael won't last long in this position if he continues to ignore what his father built." Mariana didn't change her expression. She continued listening to the parallel conversation beside her, answered when someone spoke to her, drank a sip of water with the calmness of someone who heard nothing relevant. Inside, Teresa's phrase was being catalogued with all the care it deserved. During dinner, she was positioned far from Raphael, which was expected given the size of the table. She sat between the wife of a senator from Minas Gerais, who spoke mainly about her garden, and an advisor whom Mariana recognized by the name in Raphael's folder as someone who moved between the 2 groups without clearly belonging to either. She talked to both with the same careful lightness she had practiced in recent days. And when the advisor, a man named Luciano, about 40 years old, who had the habit of observing others before speaking, asked how the transition from Taguatinga to the palace had been, she answered with a calculated candor, "Much easier than people expected, I think." Luciano smiled slightly. "Or harder than you make it seem?" It was a more perceptive observation than she had expected from that conversation. She looked at him for a second longer than usual, re-evaluating, and then she smiled. Both, perhaps. On the way back, inside the car, Raphael listened to her report everything in detail. When she reached Teresa's phrase, he stayed motionless for a moment. "Did she say that out loud?" "She believed I was far enough away not to hear." Raphael was silent for a time she already knew how to respect. Then he said only, "And Luciano? Did you notice how he asked about Taguatinga?" "I noticed. He knows more than he was pretending." Raphael nodded slowly, and Mariana realized they had crossed that night an invisible threshold. She was no longer someone he was training. She was someone with whom he was, for the first time, genuinely working. The car stopped in front of the palace entrance. Neither of them moved immediately. The silence between them was of a different quality than the previous ones, less tense, closer to something she didn't have a name for yet. It was he who spoke. "You were better than I expected tonight." There was both a compliment and an admission there. It was honest, and Raphael, she was learning, was always easier to respect when he was honest. She opened the car door. Before entering the palace, she turned briefly. "Next time we go to a Valmont event, I need you to tell me what happened with the redirected contract. Teresa mentioned it, and I didn't have enough context to understand the weight of what I was hearing." Raphael stared at her with that expression she had learned to recognize as the equivalent in him of a surprise he wouldn't let show completely. "Tomorrow morning, in the office." She nodded and went in. The redirected contract, Mariana discovered the next morning, had its own name and history. It was called the Meridional Contract, an infrastructure concession agreement in the interior of Goiás that had been originally negotiated by Raphael with years of work, and that had been transferred to another group without his formal authorization through a maneuver made within the council itself during a period when he had traveled out of the country. The transfer had been presented to the council as a technical and temporary decision. In practice, it was a message. Raphael no longer controlled what he believed he controlled. He explained this with his usual restraint, without dramatizing. But Mariana noticed by the way he held the pen without using it, by the way the muscles of his jaw tightened slightly when he reached the more delicate parts, that it hurt in a way he wasn't willing to name out loud. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked, "Does Teresa know the details or only the result?" Raphael thought for a moment. "She probably knows more than Armando imagines she knows. Teresa always knew more than she lets on. Then she could be an ally, not just a source." He was silent for an instant. It was a distinction that made a difference. A source provided information. An ally took a side, and that completely changed the equation. "I would need something to offer her," said Raphael. "Teresa doesn't act out of sympathy." Mariana thought about this throughout the entire day. She left the office, had a coffee on the veranda, walked through the garden to the shore of the lake, where there was a stone bench that had become her favorite place to think. The October sun in Brasilia was strong and dry, and the lake reflected an almost metallic clarity. She stared at the water and thought about Teresa, about how she led an entire table with a minimum of words, about how she had tolerated decades beside a husband who clearly didn't consult her on anything relevant, building her own network of influence on the margins of what was officially allowed to her. There was a story there that resembled, in some painfully familiar aspects, her own. A woman who had learned to be powerful in the spaces others discarded. The difference was that Teresa had chosen to use that power to sustain a system that limited her. Had she always wanted that? Or had she reached that point through gradual erosion, just as Mariana had reached the point of saying yes to a marriage she had never imagined? This line of reasoning was risky. She knew that. Projecting her own experience onto Teresa could lead her to serious errors in evaluation. But there was a question that seemed worth asking. Indirectly, at the right time, in the right context. The opportunity arose 3 days later, during a second lunch at the palace. This time it was a smaller group, only 4 women, including Teresa and young Deborah. The conversation was more intimate, less performative, and in the middle of lunch, when Deborah left for a few minutes to answer the phone and the other 2 dispersed slightly, Mariana and Teresa were momentarily alone at the same end of the table. Mariana didn't force the conversation. She only said, while folding her napkin carefully, "I admire how you navigate these environments. It is a rare talent to know when to speak and when to keep." Teresa looked at her with that evaluative expression Mariana already knew well. Then she said, with a lightness that wasn't completely light, "You aren't as simple as you want to seem either." Mariana didn't answer immediately. She raised her eyes and faced Teresa head-on, long enough for the other woman to understand that what would come next was not casual. "I think you and I could have a very interesting conversation if we were honest with each other." Teresa stood still for a second. It was a long second. Then she took her water glass, drank a sip, and said with a completely neutral voice, "Do you know where the gallery of the palace is? The one facing the lake?" Mariana said she knew. "Tomorrow at 10, I'll be there." Deborah returned, and the conversation followed, as if nothing had happened. That night, Mariana told Raphael about the scheduled meeting. He stood still for a moment that she learned to measure in intention and not in duration. Then he said, "This could be exactly what we need, or it could be a trap from Valmont to find out how much you know." "I know," she replied, "but we need to take this risk." He looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what is at stake?" "Yes." "And you still want to go?" "Yes." Raphael turned his body slightly, looked at the window for a moment, and then turned his face back to her. There was something different in his expression, something she had difficulty cataloguing precisely because she hadn't seen it in him yet. It wasn't concern. It wasn't just approval. It was something closer to a controlled vulnerability, as if he were letting her see for a fraction of a second that it mattered beyond the strategy. "All right," he said, "but I want to know everything when you get back." She nodded. And as she left the office for her room, she felt the weight of what she was doing settle on her shoulders with a solidity that was not of fear. It was of purpose. She had entered that palace as a piece on someone else's board, and she was, step by step, learning the rules of the game so well that it would soon be impossible to continue calling her a piece. She didn't sleep well that night. It was that kind of vigil that accompanies the eve of important things, the body lying down while the mind runs through scenarios and rehearse his silences. She thought about Teresa Valmont. There was an undeniable intelligence there, that of someone who survives for decades in an environment that was not built for you. But there was also the exhaustion of someone who spent a long time being useful to the purposes of others. She had coffee alone on the veranda, and at 9:40 walked to the gallery. The gallery was a glass corridor that connected the main body of the mansion to an annex. Along the walls were paintings from the family collection, landscapes of the Cerrado, formal portraits, and some contemporary pieces. The light at 10 in the morning was clear and almost white. Teresa was already there, her back to the entrance, examining one of the landscapes. She turned when she heard the footsteps and pointed to the wooden bench in the center. The two sat down. There was a silence that neither wanted to fill before the time. It was Teresa who began. "You know that Armando did not send her here to be Rafael's wife." It was a statement, not a question. Mariana answered with care. "Armando didn't send me anywhere. I came on my own." Teresa looked with an almost appreciative expression. "That is true, and it is also what interests me." She adjusted her position on the bench. "Rafael is in a more fragile position than he appears, but also stronger than Armando believes. The point is that both are underestimating a variable." Mariana waited. "You," said Teresa simply. The silence that followed had a different quality. It was a silence of mutual recognition, two women who had reached the same point by opposite paths, speaking directly for the first time. Mariana said, "You want the balance to change." Teresa looked at the Cerrado landscape for a moment. Then she said with a lower voice, "I want things to be done fairly. Armando acts as if everything belongs to him. There is a limit to how long that can last before the weight collapses on everyone." It was the most revealing statement Teresa had made since they met. "And what do you need from me?" "Nothing you aren't already doing. Keep observing, keep listening, and when the moment comes, and it will come, you will know what to do with what you learned." When the two separated and Mariana walked back to the main body of the palace, there was a clarity in her ideas that the nights of analysis hadn't yet produced. The game was broader than Rafael had described, and the turn he expected might need a hand that neither of them had foreseen. There was something Mariana hadn't told Rafael about the meeting with Teresa in the gallery. It wasn't disloyalty. It was caution born of a careful reading of the situation. An unexpected ally within the adversary's field was a powerful piece, but it was also a piece that could turn at any moment. She needed to be sure of Teresa's motivations, to understand what moved that woman beneath the chosen words, before putting her name on the table for Rafael. Honesty had been the only condition she imposed in the agreement, and she respected it. But there was a distinction, which she had learned in those weeks, between reporting facts and reporting conclusions. Facts could be told immediately. Conclusions needed time to settle. So she stayed with that for a few days. During this period, the palace went through a different movement. Rafael had meetings almost every day and arrived for dinner with a tiredness that went beyond the physical. Mariana observed everything from the margins, the advisor Luciano appearing frequently and with an expression too neutral to be natural, Conceição moving between floors with a new tension in her shoulders, and Rafael's silence denser than usual. It was during one of the nightly conversations in the office that he placed a document on the table that she hadn't seen before. It was a draft of a summons for an extraordinary meeting of the Drummond Council with a single agenda: the review of the governance structure and the re-evaluation of the powers delegated to the head of the family. In direct language, a formal attempt to remove Rafael from the position he had inherited. Mariana read the draft twice. Then she said, "They think they have enough votes. They need a simple majority, 7 advisors. If 4 vote in favor, it's enough." "And how many are with them?" "For sure, 3. Armando and 2 others. The 4th is uncertain." "Who is the 4th?" "Edgar Motta. He's been with the family for 30 years. He was my father's partner." Mariana recorded the name. She had seen Edgar at Valmont's dinner, a man with white hair, quiet, who had spent most of the night listening without participating. She had passed him quickly during the circulation of guests and hadn't given him enough attention. That was one of the only mistakes she could identify that night, and the fact that he was emerging now as the central point of the play gave this lapse a retroactive importance. That was the mistake she needed to correct. Do you have a way to get to him before the meeting? Directly, no. Any approach from me he will interpret as desperation, and Edgard Motta does not respect desperation, she thought. Does his wife attend the palace lunches? Raphael raised his eyes. She did, in the past. Selma distanced herself from these circles after a friction with Teresa. Years ago, she made a public comment about the management of a foundation that Teresa coordinated. The friction remained, and Selma was gradually left out of the events. Mariana stood still for a second. Then she said, more to herself than to him, "So Selma has an open account with Teresa, and Teresa told me she wants things to be done fairly." Raphael looked at her with attention. "You didn't tell me everything about the meeting in the gallery." She took a deep breath and told him what she had kept, Teresa's words in the gallery, the different tone in the woman's voice when she spoke about Armando, the growing suspicion that there was a possible alliance there that went far beyond the simple exchange of information. While she spoke, she observed Raphael. She saw the exact moment when he connected the pieces, his expression going from evaluative silence to something closer to recognition. If Teresa is willing to act, and Selma can be approached by her, and Edgard still has loyalty to what my father truly built, that changes the calculation completely. He paused. "You did well to wait before telling me. You needed to be sure." "I'm still not absolutely sure," she said with honesty, "but I have enough conviction to bet. But you will need Teresa to trust me enough to take this step." The two stared at each other for a moment. There was between them that night something that had begun to be different from previous nights, without either of them having named it. The office conversations had stopped being briefing sessions and become something Mariana didn't have an exact word to describe. A collaboration that went beyond the strategic, a presence that had become, without warning, necessary in ways neither of them had planned. She said nothing about it. He didn't either. But the silence that remained after she left the office had a different weight than the previous ones. The next morning she sent a message to Teresa. Brief, direct. They needed to meet again. The answer arrived in 10 minutes, this time not in the gallery, at Teresa's private residence in Lago Sul, the next morning at 11. Teresa's residence was smaller than Valmont's, but incomparably more inhabited. Real flowers on the entrance table, books with bookmarks on the shelves, a dining table with marks of real use. There was the presence of someone who actually lived in that space. Teresa received Mariana in the living room with coffee and without assistants present. It was the first time the two were completely alone, without the context of a larger event around them, without other eyes circulating. There was a different frankness in this. "Selma Motta called me." Mariana controlled her expression. "Did you contact her?" "She contacted me, which is even better. The message between the lines was about Edgard. He is not comfortable with what is being prepared. There is an old loyalty that Armando is underestimating." "What does Edgard need to take a position?" "He needs to see that Raphael is not the weak man Armando is painting, but in a spontaneous way. He detects calculated effort and rejects it immediately." Mariana nodded. What if the meeting between Raphael and Edgard happened in a neutral context, no agenda, no visible schedule? Teresa considered. Selma is going to a piano recital next Friday, a small event they both have attended for years. Edgard normally accompanies her. And what if Raphael were there too? Teresa's silence was the answer, a silence that said, this could work. When Mariana left and got back into the car, she called Raphael immediately. He answered on the second ring, and she realized in that small detail that he had been waiting. "Do you have plans for next Friday night?" A short pause. "I do now." "You do?" "I'll explain everything when I get back." She hung up and looked out the window as the car followed through Asa Sul toward the palace. The Cerrado passed by with that golden tone of the late afternoon, arid in appearance, but sustaining a biodiversity that most people never stop to see. There were deep roots in that land that no one saw because they were beneath the surface. Mariana thought there was something in that which resembled, in a way she couldn't completely name, herself. The recital took place in a cultural space in the Château de Club-Soul, a small room with a capacity for about 60 people, wooden walls that helped with acoustics, and burgundy velvet chairs arranged in soft rows. It was the kind of event that didn't appear in social columns or political agendas, and that was exactly what made it useful. Raphael had agreed to the plan without much hesitation. What had surprised Mariana wasn't the agreement, but the way he had said yes, without asking for details of how she had arrived at that information, without questioning the strategy, without overlapping his analysis with hers. It was the first time since the beginning of everything that he simply trusted, and she had felt the weight of that in a way she didn't expect. They arrived at the recital 5 minutes early. Mariana had chosen deliberately simple clothing, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that looked prepared for a specific occasion. Raphael came from a meeting and kept his suit, but had taken off his tie in the car, which gave a calculated informality that served perfectly. The room was almost full when they arrived. Mariana swept the room quickly and located Edgard and Selma Motta in the third row on the left side. Selma was a woman with red hair, medium height, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of frequenting formal environments without letting herself be swallowed by them. Edgard was beside her, leafing through the recital program with that quiet attention Mariana had noticed at Valmont's dinner. She lightly touched Raphael's arm and indicated with a discreet gesture the direction. He saw. He made no sign of recognition, but she perceived by the way his body adjusted slightly that he had registered it. They found seats in the row behind, on the same side. It was a position that allowed them to observe without being the center of attention, and that placed Raphael in Edgard's peripheral visual field without causing any immediate direct encounter. The recital began. It was a young pianist, a man in his 30s who played Schubert with a restraint Mariana sincerely appreciated. The room went silent, and for 40 minutes the only sound was the music, which filled the space with that specific quality of live piano, more alive than in any recording, more imperfect and therefore more real. Mariana wasn't there to listen to music, but she listened anyway. There was something in that room, in the collective concentration, in the fact that everyone was turned toward the same thing at the same time. That produced a pause in the defense mechanisms that normally worked in social environments. People, when they listen to real music, become a little more themselves. In the intermission, when the lights came on and conversations restarted, Mariana stood up with Raphael near the drinks table. She kept the conversation between them light, about the music, about nothing in particular. And she waited. It was Selma who approached first. She came toward the drinks table with a naturalness Mariana recognized as genuine. There was no rehearsal in that step, no calculated hesitation. Selma simply saw Raphael, saw Mariana, and walked to them with the ease of someone who decides, in the impulse of the moment, that it's worth saying hello. "Raphael, it's been a while." She greeted him with a brief handshake and then turned to Mariana. "You must be Mariana. Teresa told me about you." It was the first time Teresa's name was said out loud as a bridge between the two. Mariana replied with a direct smile. "Good things, I hope." "Honest things," said Selma, "which, coming from Teresa, is more valuable." Edgard arrived soon after, with 2 glasses of water in his hands, and stopped when he saw Raphael. There was a second of mutual evaluation, 2 men who had known each other for decades, separated by a line that neither of them had drawn alone, recognizing each other in a neutral space. It was Edgard who spoke first. "Raphael." "Edgard." A pause. "Good recital." "It always is when he plays." Edgard handed one of the glasses to Selma and stood with the posture of someone who didn't run away, but also didn't advance. "How has the management been?" It was a question that could be protocol or real, depending on who asked it and how. Coming from Edgard in that context, at that moment, Mariana interpreted it as real, and she saw Raphael interpret it the same way. Raphael answered with honesty and without performance, spoke of ongoing projects, of a new partnership with an infrastructure group from the Northeast, of an internal restructuring that had cost months but was starting to show results. He spoke like someone who knows what he's doing, not like someone trying to convince. Edgard listened with attention. He didn't ask rhetorical questions, didn't rehearse skepticism. He listened as someone measuring something that matters. When the bell rang calling back for the second part of the recital, the four headed into the room together, and by a natural moment ended up sitting in the same row, Selma next to Mariana, Edgard next to Raphael, with the spontaneity of a meeting that hadn't been scheduled by anyone. In the second half of the recital, Brahms replaced Schubert, and the music became denser, more loaded with intention. Mariana listened and thought she had reached the limit of what she could control. She had done what was in her power, created the condition, maintained the appropriate context, let the two men meet without visible mediation. The rest depended on Edgard, on Selma, on the old loyalty Raphael had described and that she had bet still existed. When the recital ended and the applause dispersed, Edgard leaned slightly toward Raphael before they stood up. Mariana didn't hear what he said. She was far enough away not to catch the words. But she saw Raphael nod once, slowly, with that restraint she had learned to read as a definitive yes. On the way back to the palace, Raphael was silent during the first minutes of the journey. It wasn't the closed silence of the first weeks. It was the silence of someone organizing thoughts that hadn't finished forming yet. Mariana left him in peace with that, looking out the window at the lights of Brasilia spreading across the Plano Piloto with that precise geometry that only made sense seen from above. When he finally spoke, he said, "Edgard asked for a meeting, just the two of us, before the board meeting." Mariana continued looking out the window for a second before turning. "When?" "Next week, at his office." She nodded. It was what needed to happen. Edgard had left that recital willing to hear what Raphael had to say, away from Armando's eyes. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a real opening. And real openings were what had been necessary to build since the beginning. "You went beyond what I asked," said Raphael. The sentence was simple, but it carried a weight he didn't try to disguise. "I did what needed to be done." "I know." A pause. "Thank you." It was the first time he had said that, and there was in the way he said it, without grandiloquence, without ceremony, an authenticity that reached her in a different way from any recognition she had received before. It wasn't gratitude for services rendered. It was the recognition of someone who had seen what she had done and understood what it had cost to do it. Mariana didn't answer. She turned her face back to the window and stayed that way until the car entered the palace gate. But inside there was something she would need later in the quiet of her room to examine carefully. A specific warmth in that thank you that she wasn't completely sure how to name. And that didn't have to do, she knew, only with the agreement they had sealed weeks ago. The extraordinary meeting of the Drummond Council was called for a Thursday morning. The location was the meeting room on the upper floor of the palace, a space Mariana had seen from afar but had never entered. She would not be present at the meeting. No wife would be. It was a formally male space, formally closed, and it had been that way for decades. But there was something Mariana had learned in those weeks. The results of closed rooms are determined in the conversations that happen outside them. In the week before the board meeting, she had observed the palace's rhythm change perceptibly. Raphael left earlier, arrived later. The nightly conversations in the office became shorter, not for lack of subject matter, but for the density of what was in each sentence. There was a restraint in both, a concentration that resembled strangely the silence before a rain that hasn't started yet, but that the air already feels. Raphael's meeting with Edgard had happened on Wednesday of the previous week. Raphael hadn't told the details that night. He had arrived late, found Mariana reading on the veranda, and sat beside her for a time without speaking. Then he said only, "Edgard is going to vote with us." There was no celebration in his voice. It was the confirmation of something that had been built with care and was now standing, but that still needed to resist the weight of the actual vote. On the morning of the assembly, Mariana woke up before the sun. She went down to the kitchen, prepared coffee, took a cup to Raphael, who was already in the office with documents spread over the table. She left the cup without saying anything. He raised his eyes for a second, and there was in that look something she didn't try to analyze immediately. A kind of anchoring, as if her presence were, at that moment, a concrete thing he needed, without knowing how to ask. She went to the veranda to wait. The advisors arrived throughout the morning. Mariana could hear the cars in the courtyard below, the footsteps in the corridor leading to the upper floor, the distant murmur of voices greeting each other with the formality of those about to do something that couldn't be undone. Armando Valmont arrived last, as was to be expected of someone who had calculated every detail of that summons. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Mariana stayed on the veranda during all that time, except for the moments she went in to get water, or to check if Conceição needed anything. Banal acts she practiced with an acute awareness that each minute passing was a minute in which something irreversible was being decided upstairs. When she heard the meeting room door open and footsteps coming down the stairs, she didn't stand up immediately. She stayed sitting, hands on her knees, and waited. Raphael appeared on the veranda a few minutes later. He had his jacket on his arm, his tie slightly loosened, and there was an expression on his face she took a moment to read, not because it was opaque, but because it was new. It was the relief of someone who carried something heavy for a long time and could finally set it down. 4-3, he said. The vote had been favorable to him. Edgard had voted as he said he would. The attempt at removal had been rejected. Mariana stood still for a second. Then she nodded once, slowly. Raphael looked at her for a moment, and then he said something she wasn't expecting. "I need to tell you something I should have said before." She raised her eyes. He sat in the chair beside her, which was different from how he normally positioned himself. Always standing, always with control of the space. Sitting, there was a horizontality between the two that was new. "When I said I chose you because you would be invisible to them, that was true. But it wasn't everything." He paused. "I met you once before the lunch in Lago Sul. You don't know this. It was in a corridor of an event your company participated in, more than a year ago. You solved a logistical problem in real time with a precision most executives I know wouldn't have. I noticed I filed it away, and when I needed someone with that quality, I remembered you." The silence that settled after those words was of a different quality from all the other silences they had shared. It was the silence of a revelation that recontextualized everything, not just the marriage, not just the agreement, but the very starting point of a story Mariana had believed began with her being chosen by discard. She had been chosen for competence, from the beginning. "You could have told me that before," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath the calm she didn't try to hide completely. "I could have." He didn't apologize, but there was in the tone something close to regret. "I needed you to get here for what you are, not for what I think of you. If I had said it from the beginning, you would have carried that as an expectation, and I wanted to see what you would do without it." Mariana stayed with that for a long moment. Outside, the lake reflected the November sky, and the crickets on the shore made their usual noise, indifferent to what was being decided up there. "It's a lot to process at once," she said at last. "I know." A pause. "We have time." It was the simplest sentence he had said since she knew him. And also, she realized with a clarity that surprised her, the truest. There was a life ahead of those two that hadn't been drawn yet, an open space neither of them had planned, but that was there anyway, waiting. She didn't answer, but she didn't get up, and the silence that remained between the two was, this time, the silence of something beginning. Later, when the advisors had already left, Mariana walked through the upper floor corridor for the first time. She stopped before a window overlooking the garden, where 2 employees were silently removing the meeting chairs. There was in that everyday gesture, stowing the chairs, continuing life, something she found unexpectedly moving. She thought about what Raphael had revealed. More than a year ago, in a corridor she hadn't registered, someone had paid attention and seen in her something she herself had stopped seeing after years of invisible existence. It wasn't love. She was honest enough not to confuse recognition with love. But it was the beginning of something without a name yet. Respect that survived the pressure. Trust built in adversity. A presence that had become necessary in ways no agreement had foreseen. There was still much to be done. Armando had lost the vote, but people like him didn't disappear because they had lost a battle. The meridional contract still needed to be resolved, the council reconfigured, and Mariana, who had arrived at the palace as a disposable element in someone else's calculation, was now at the center of everything, not because someone had put her there, because she had walked to that center, step by step, with her eyes open. When she reached the office, Raphael was standing by the window as on the first night. The posture was different. The tiredness was still there, but there was something lighter in him, as if the weight of the weeks had finally found a place to rest. She entered and went to the chair by his side. He looked at her. "How are you?" It was the first time he had asked that question. Not about the strategy, not about what she had heard, about her. Mariana thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, "I am whole." Raphael was quiet. And then he smiled for real, not the calculated smile of public events. A simple, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Well," he said, "then we can begin." It was true. What was between them was at the same time the end of a first part and the beginning of another. But there was in that a freedom Mariana hadn't felt in a long time, the freedom of not knowing what would come and of wanting to find out anyway. 3 months after the extraordinary meeting, the Palacio Alvorada dos Lagos looked the same on the outside. The gardens impeccable, the lake reflecting the summer sky, the employees moving with the usual silent efficiency. But those who knew that house up close knew that something had changed irreversibly in its foundations. The meridional contract had been revised and returned to Raphael's management by a unanimous decision of a reformulated board subcommittee, with the strategic abstention of Armando Valmont, who had learned in those months the cost of underestimating variables he couldn't control. Edgard Motta had assumed, in an informal but undeniable way, the role of senior advisor who actually guided and didn't just vote. And Teresa Valmont had started a conversation with Selma Motta that, according to both, should have happened much sooner. Mariana found out about all this not through reports or nightly briefings in the office, though those still happened with a different quality, closer to conversation than to strategy. She found out because she had become, in that circle, a presence that people began to consult naturally, without realizing exactly when it had started. It was an irony she appreciated in silence. She had arrived at that palace to be invisible. She had become visible by having mastered invisibility better than anyone expected. One afternoon in February, she was on the stone bench by the lake, the place that had become hers by frequenting it so much, when Raphael came to sit beside her without warning. He did that sometimes now, appearing without an agenda, without a declared strategic purpose. It was a new habit she had learned to recognize as his way of saying things he didn't yet know how to put into words. They were silent for a time, looking at the lake. Then he said, "I received an expansion proposal for the northeast. It will require at least 6 months away from Brasilia." She turned her face to him. And I wanted to know what you think." It was a simple sentence, but there was in it something she needed a second to process. He was asking, not communicating a decision made, not presenting an already defined plan that needed her execution. He was asking what she thought, because what she thought mattered for what he would do next. Mariana thought about the woman who had descended the satin ivory stairs in a palace that wasn't hers, in a dress chosen by others, to marry a man who hadn't turned his face to receive her. She thought about the logistics analyst from Taguatinga, who had spent years being the invisible structure that sustained everything around her, without anyone asking what she wanted. And she thought she had reached, in a way she hadn't planned, a place where someone asked. "I think we should go," she said. Raphael nodded, and the lake reflected the two in silence, side by side, as it had done every day since she arrived, without knowing, back at the beginning, that that pool of quiet water was to become one of the few things that she, in that entire palace, would call her own. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mariana and Raphael has touched something true in you, the strength that exists in those who learn to be seen by their own eyes before expecting the world to do so. If you've made it this far, you know that the best part of a good story isn't the end. It's everything it awakens in those who listen. We've prepared a special list with equally passionate stories to continue this journey with you. Find it right here on the side. If this narrative moved you in any way, leave your like and write in the comments what Mariana taught you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our next releases. Every week we bring stories that explore what is most intense and true in the human experience. Until the next story. See you then. The end of the story.